has it ready too. I told him not to leave me. Yeah, and then you should be good. And then just when you're ready to turn it on, and then I'll borrow.
What's that? Okay.
Members of the public, we're waiting for city staff to finish putting a little bit of some documentation together from some meetings that happened with the applicant earlier today. So we might take a couple of minutes while we wait for one member of city staff to come. So I'm just going to call like 5 more minutes, just in case you guys want to step out. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'd like to open the Planning Commission meeting for July 11th, 2017, and welcome everybody to beautiful Half Moon Bay. So, going through our agenda, the first thing I have on the agenda is the roll call.
Okay, Commissioner DeMond is absent this evening. Commissioner Benjamin?
Here.
Commissioner Evans?
Here.
Commissioner and Vice Chair Holt?
Here.
And Chair Hernandez?
Present. Okay. And then the next item on our agenda is the approval of minutes from June 27th, 2017. I was not present for this. I'll ask our chairman to make a motion to approve the minutes unless there are any comments or questions.
I will make a motion to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion approved.
Great. Okay, so I noticed there's no planning manager's report or anything like that on today's meeting. So I assume as we discussed previously, we're going to pass on the planning commission, or planning manager's report.
We moved it to the end. We thought it was to the benefit of our community to do that, unless there's something hot that we got to share. Okay.
We're all good there.
Good.
So, excellent. Okay, so then the next item is we have public forum. For those of you who would like to speak on an item that is not on tonight's agenda, you can fill out one of these green cards and speak. And just looking through, I do have two public forum comments. One from Brian Shepard. Are you speaking on on the public item, or you actually want to speak for public forum? Great, please. And then followed by Joe Chamberlain.
There we go. So I own the lot at 890 Main Street, and I realized that it was zoned as residential, as R2, and it had been grandfathered in for the use as commercial, so for my lot and the lot next to it. And when I looked at the zoning, I saw that they had zoned the R2 going down Parisma Street and kind of come down the entire way. And so I think they just kind of scooped up those two commercial lots. And currently in those two lots, there's 2 different dental practices, a doctor's office, a chiropractor. There's also a hair salon, and Driftwood Healing is also there as well too. And so I think that if we could rezone these as either commercial downtown or commercial residential, it'd bring the lots into what they're currently being used as under the what they're grandfathered in as.
Thank you for your comments. Just for my clarity, where on the map are we?
Oh, sorry, it's between Poplar and Spruce. It's just to the right of the R2,
Okay.
right to the left of the Bloom. It's on the west side of Main Street.
Okay. Duly noted.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I assume city staff, you're tracking that comment.
We know about that one. Thank you.
Great. Joe, thank you. Joe?
Joe Chamberlain, speaking on behalf of the Coastside Land Trust this evening. We have the good fortune to have received a grant from San Mateo County Parks Department.
Joe, is your microphone on?
Green.
Okay.
Did you hear anything I said? Okay. So San Mateo County Parks gave us money to plan the last portion of the coastal trail through Wave Crest, which also happens to be the last portion of the coastal trail through the city of Half Moon Bay. We are to the point where we have some lovely maps to show you with the trail alignment, and we are inviting you and everyone who's interested to join us on August 26th at 10 a.m. for a toast to the trail, and there will be mimosas, and we request that you bring your own glass. Hope to see you there.
August 26th, 10 a.m. I'll bring my own plastic REI wine glass. Where is it at? Is it at Coastside Land Trusts on Main Street?
Yes, it's going to be probably just the other side of the Seymour Bridge, the south side of the Seymour Bridge, where we've had many of our parties in the past.
Okay, great.
And then we'll take tours of the new trail area.
Thank you.
Through the chair. Yeah, I just, as a matter of formality, if a majority of commissioners attend, we may want to notice it as a meeting. Thank you.
I don't think we're required to notice it as a meeting unless we're discussing city business. But that's fair. I'm not sure if I'm going to attend, but if I do, I'll email staff. Very good. Thank you. Have any other items for public forum from members of the public? If not, I will close the public forum. And we will move on to the first public hearing item that we have.
Again, through the chair.
Yes.
So we just, when the time comes, I have some ex partes I want to be sure to fit in. But we just received a memo. I imagine there's a public copy, but I want to be sure it's available for the public. Thank you. So I want to be sure the public is aware of that. And also, since it's part of the record, I think we need to read it. Frankly, maybe I'm a slow reader, but I haven't done it yet.
Yeah, I think we should probably take a moment to read through the document.
Either now or after the staff presentation, because we will provide a bit of an overview of this subject and maybe then take a quick 5 or 10 minute break before our applicant has a presentation. And I think that would afford everyone at least a little bit of time to digest it. Okay, very good.
I'm fine with that.
Right.
Do you want to discuss your ex parte communications? Or ex parte?
I can bring them up now, or I can bring them up after the staff report. That's also fine. The staff report may cover it, and I can just make reference, so that'll save some time.
That's fine.
Also, just from point of view of the comfort and comprehension of the staff as well as the planning commission, there's a bright light that makes it hard to read. I wonder if we could just put, like, would it be okay if I put a book under the? Yeah, but if we stick something under it, I bet it'll be a lot more legible.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine, yeah.
The plans. Okay.
Bingo.
Sunny weather in Half Moon Bay. What's the world coming to?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay.
I didn't even see.
So on to staff for the presentation, please.
All right. Scott will be presenting the proposed project at 32 Jenna Lane tonight. Before he gets going on that, I wanted to share with you that we have revised the staff recommendation since the staff report went out on Thursday, and that is the purpose of this memo. It is a summary of the basis for the revision to our recommendation, as well as includes written correspondence that we've received, one new letter, and summary of communications with our applicant, as well as a summary of planning commission options, which are a little bit different than what you have in your staff report, and you will see that on the final slide of the presentation. To not keep you in suspense, in brief, this revision to our recommendation, we're recommending that you continue this item tonight. We have reevaluated the findings that were made for consideration of project compatibility, and they're specifically completely reliant on vegetative screening, and so we'd like to talk to you about that and include that hopefully in your discussion tonight. There are people here, I understand, to speak on the item. Our applicant is here and prepared to present, so we would hope that you could receive the staff presentation, read the memo, hear the applicant's presentation, take public comment, and hold a discussion and give us some guidance on this. This is something that we've been digging into, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it when Scott is done. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay.
Thanks, Jill, and Mr. Chair and members of the Planning Commission. The project includes not only the new residence, but we've also included the conversion of the existing guest house on the site to an accessory dwelling unit. The new residence, 7,945 square feet, and associated site improvements, which include landscaping on a portion of the lot, as well as expanding the driveway to access the new house. Permits requested include a coastal development permit, use permit for residential, architectural review. Permitting history on the house. It was initially reviewed by the Planning Commission back in 2001, or I should say approved in 2001. That included a residence of roughly, the guest house that's currently there, as well as a residence totaling roughly 7,000 square feet. The guest house was constructed in 2004, and then a formal withdrawal from the owners at the time of the main residence was received by city staff. Since that time, the new owners proposed a new residence, which was reviewed by the Planning Commission back in September. Two Planning Commission members were not on the Planning Commission at the time, but we provided all the information from that meeting, including the video and all correspondence, so the two new Planning Commissioners can be involved with this, the review of the new residence. Previous Planning Commission concerns and recommendations included the concerns with a lack of building articulation and compatibility regarding mass and bulk with the surrounding neighborhood, as well as the request that the project be redesigned to more aptly fit the coastal environment and include additional sustainability measures into the project. Planning Commission also requested a detailed landscape plan, as well as more analysis, in particular our legal staff, on the enforceability of the Matucci subdivision appeal meeting, and then also a minor change to the initial study, the draft initial study that was included with this, the project review, and then also to include the conversion of the existing guest house on the site. The site itself consists of a large rectangular lot, as you can see in the green there, and it's physically separated from Cypress and the corner of Cypress and Jenna through an access and utility easement across the neighboring property in blue. To the north is the Pilarcitos Creek and surrounding riparian area. To the east is a city park, as well as one of our multifamily portions of the city. The site is within the Kelly Avenue Tract subdivision, the Matucci planned unit development, and is identified as a visual resource area since it is a planned unit development in Half Moon Bay. So the analysis that we recommend that the Planning Commission take into consideration is relative to the applicable zoning regulations, development standards, LCP policies, as well as the single-family residential design guidelines. So what I've included on this slide is the front elevation of the new design. And a couple of noticeable differences from the old design is the elimination of the grand staircase accessing the reverse floor plan that was included in the previous proposal. Several of the gables have been shifted, modified, reducing some of the bulk of the previous building. Staff met with the design team on several occasions to go over some of the recommendations that the Planning Commission had previously, in particular sustainability measures, and referencing our design guidelines as well as recommending other things. And the new design, they did have the idea behind providing a more efficient design with the new one, as well as pervious pavers for the new driveway. And then here's the previous design to give you an idea of what was previously proposed. The new design is marginally smaller by 345 square feet. And now the Matucci subdivision appeal meeting agreement. After the last meeting, we did request a complete chain of title from the applicant, which they provided, and we reviewed that with our legal staff. And the conclusion was that the city itself was never a party to this agreement, and that the agreement was never recorded at the San Mateo County Recorder's Office. With those two items in mind, the city cannot enforce the Matucci subdivision appeal meeting. That said, there are items within the appeal agreement that when you read through this, it does have the intention of some of the items that we all that our policies do align with, I should say. So we did also receive a more developed landscape plan. The applicant did hire a landscape consultant to assist them with the design of the landscape. New landscape design includes a split rail fence separating along the top there, separating the new landscaped area from the riparian buffer to the north. We referred the landscape plan to our biologist on this job, Coast Range, to review the landscape that's proposed, and they did recommend several change. One change in particular, a plant species that was they saw as moderately invasive, so we had that change done. Several questions have come up as far as stormwater management measures that are included in the project, and whether or not there are bioswales included. And what the design team has selected is a detention basin that's been sized to accommodate for the additional impervious surface on the site. Their civil engineer provided stamped and signed plans that include calculations for the detention basin. Also, they provided us with a small projects checklist for stormwater management, and the items that were selected are included on the plan set. So this slide includes the proposed site plan that, and what we've done here is we requested that the applicant include the buffers from what the biologist has provided us. So they superimpose the buffers onto the site plan itself, which include the 50-foot riparian buffer from the edge of riparian vegetation, as well as a 100-foot buffer from the poison hemlock on the site. The poison hemlock indication is something that the Coastal Commission staff asked that we include on the site plan. And we've had several conversations and met with coastal staff on this project. This slide, similar to the last one, it includes the proposed trail easement that is included on the site plan. And Half Moon Bay Municipal Code requires that the establishment of a trail access to coastal recreation for new development between the nearest public road and the sea. And you probably noticed in your staff report that we've included a condition of approval that the trail easement be recorded before we issue the building permit for this project. That said, the trail is not included in the project, just the easement.
I'm sorry, Scott, if you could go back. Can you just point out where that trail easement is?
So it runs along here is the 10-foot portion, and then a 20-foot wide portion that runs along the edge within the riparian buffer, but outside of the poison hemlock that's shown here. So it does, a bit of a circuitous route here, but that's one suggestion that coastal staff had, is that they requested that the trail easement be outside of the poison hemlock.
Thank you.
So, and the idea, but the difference between the 10-foot along this area here and parallel to the creek is that there is substantial grade changes here that would necessitate, possible retaining walls or small retaining walls, design of the trail. It'll provide additional flexibility in the design of the trail that, at this point is not contemplated, but we're just asking for the easement. So in regard to design compatibility in the surrounding area, this photograph was taken from the coastal trail facing east. And notice the story poles on the left in relation to the other neighboring houses. And the Planning Commission is encouraged to, evaluate the, how the proposed house is compatible with the existing neighborhood as far as mass and bulk. In the previous meeting, we did receive substantial correspondence from some of the neighbors on the concern about short-term rental, Airbnbs and such being established. Currently, our regulations do not allow for short-term rental in residential. To ease the concerns, so to speak, we've added an additional condition of approval requesting a deed restriction to limit the short-term rental from of this property to prohibiting it less than 30 days. As you know, a draft mitigated negative declaration is included with your packet, which would need to be adopted before any approval takes place. All of the mitigation measures that were recommended by the biologist were included in the MMRP. And let's see, so as Jill mentioned earlier, we did revise our recommendation, and she touched upon that with in regard to the landscaping and reevaluating the compatibility in the visual resource area. And so this slide summarizes what Jill mentioned earlier, that the Planning Commission, we encourage you to evaluate the project and provide us feedback on what any concerns you may have or questions, and there are some options on this project. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So.
Questions?
Perhaps we can I'd like to reserve the right to ask after we hear Jill's supplementary report.
Okay.
So Scott can clearly answer all those project details. I'm back here with you to talk a little bit more about the revised staff recommendation. The staff recommendation in your Thursday packet, the findings were for compatibility were substantially dependent upon the presence of vegetative screening, and it's quite effectively screening the site at this point in time. And that's been an interesting challenge in that we've heard from our neighbors that they are actually concerned about some of the screening that is present from some past history of this subdivision approval, and in fact you can see that in the Matucci neighborhood agreement, the appeal agreement that Scott referenced. But also I have been digging away on your local coastal land use plan, and I happen to be working on the scenic and visual resources section of it, and rediscovered a few things. And one of the things was page 2 of your memo was a draft policy about landscape screening and prioritizing avoidance of impacts to visual resources through site selection and design alternatives as a preferred method. And it goes on to cite the entire draft policy. Now, staff is clearly aware this is not an adopted city policy, but what we note here is this is a sound explanation for how to prioritize looking at structures versus vegetation. And we went back to look at the basis of why we put this draft policy into your first draft document. And it actually, at the bottom of page 1 of your memo, comes from the California Coastal Commission Local Coastal Program Update Guidance Document. So this is the guidance from your Coastal Commission, and for which this project could be appealed to, for how to evaluate compatibility and prioritize that. So we took that quite seriously, and we also noted that the really very wonderful part of the project that we wholeheartedly recommend, which is this access easement, there's foreseeable vegetation removal just from that project. Maybe not all of it, but some of it would be thinned, in particular on the east side of the site. And we studied sight lines from Oak Avenue Park, from Oak Avenue, as well as Jenna, other side streets, Balboa, the California Coastal Trail, etc. And the change in vegetation, we believe, will change the perception of the structure. And we note and had the discussion with our applicant today that there are other very large homes on Jenna Lane, and they are visible from those same viewing locations. So this one happens to be bigger, but you will see that it isn't that aspect of it that is bringing us to reconsider how to evaluate compatibility per se. It is certainly not that in and of itself. It's simply that we based all the findings on one thing that we don't think we should have based all of our findings on. So we apologize for the timing on this, and we also want to make sure everyone has ample time and is not at any kind of disadvantage in being prepared for this meeting. Our applicant is here and ready to present. You all need a little bit of time to read this memo, but in fact, we assume that we'd like to meet again. At least that's our recommendation. And we've provided findings for you. Well, not findings, I should call them, give me a sec. Our design, it's your evaluation criteria out of your local coastal implementation plan, otherwise known as your zoning ordinance. And we were looking at the proposal on 3 scales, which I personally recommend doing. We looked at the site in and of itself, because there are design evaluation criteria that just focus on the site. We felt that you should also take a look at it from the perspective of the PUD and the specific plan, which is part of your staff report. And then, of course, always the surrounding land uses and neighborhoods, which in this particular location is really quite interesting, with multifamily and a riparian corridor and currently active agricultural uses on an urban reserve property, as well as the rest of the PUD on Jenna Lane. So we really hope that we can have a productive evening. And that said, this is just our recommendation at this point in time. The Planning Commission, if you're comfortable moving forward, you have every ability to proceed with this item and take action on it to approve. You have findings and conditions of approval all prepared for you. If you were looking at it from a significantly different perspective and you were looking to deny this project, then as typically happens here, we would be asked by you to prepare a resolution and bring it to your next meeting. So that's kind of the full range. Of course, you can deviate within that. Also want to note, attachment 1 to this memo is a summary of just a few little development conditions or site conditions of the other properties on Jenna Lane, the other developed sites, lot area, and our best estimate at floor area. Some of these we were able to find the project files, so we put the height in. We don't have quick access to all of these, so we're relying on some county information, and we used the best sources that we had to put this together quickly. If anybody in the audience is a resident on Jenna Lane and you notice something doesn't look right, we'd like to know about that. And the next attachment is the letter that we received today, I think. Yes. In some, that letter did note support for the access easement and the condition regarding the deed restriction about short-term rentals. So we just wanted to highlight that. And that's our report. If you have project-specific questions for Scott or anything about this additional new information from me before you take your break to read, let me know.
Do you have any questions?
Yes, I do. So thank you for the report and thank you for the updates. First, I should make an ex parte communication announcement so that we're all operating with the same information and the public is aware of the information that we're operating with. So over the weekend, I stopped by the area and I had a conversation with one of the neighbors who is Mr. Berman, Matt Berman, who I believe is here tonight. And the essence of that conversation was his recollection of the negotiation of the agreement between Mr. Williamson and the neighbors, and that the intention, he felt that the city intended for that to be an expression of what constituted compatibility with the neighborhood, and that they thought that it was supposed to be binding. I also spoke with him about the cypress and the shrubs that are in at the eastern edge of the parcel, and heard his concerns about the screening impacts and the height and the inconsistency of that height with the agreement between the neighbors and the developer. So that was my first ex parte communication. The second was a conversation I had with Mayor Ruddick. I spoke with her by phone later that afternoon and asked her, since she was involved in the conversation that negotiated that agreement that was read into the record, I asked her about her intention and the intention of the council at the time that was read. And she confirmed that she believed that was a intended to have been a binding agreement that was to be imposed on development in that subdivision. It's clear from the staff report that it doesn't seem to have come out that way. So the relevant information in my ex parte report is just that that was her understanding of the city council's intention. She said otherwise they wouldn't have wasted their time having a conversation about an agreement that would not have taken force. So thanks for letting me get those out first.
Thanks.
Then some questions on the development. Scott, thanks for the additional information about the drainage. That's always an interesting subject for me. If it is in the plan about the size of the storm frequency event that the drainage catchment basin is capable of holding, I missed it. Do you happen to know whether they designed the thing at the end of the catchment for the 10-year or the 25-year or the 100-year, acknowledging that those are not always current thinking for how to measure these things?
Yes, I don't recall the actual, I believe it's the 10-year storm cycle. But I believe, I think you're right. I don't recall seeing that in the plans either. But that detail will need to be submitted with the building permit.
I see. Then another drainage-related issue. This site is unlike a lot of other sites in the city in that it's immediately adjacent to agriculture. And of course, this project is sited well to the east of the larger PUD. But has thought been given to making sure that whatever household chemicals or fertilizers or whatever is used in the course of landscaping, that doesn't find its way down into the agricultural operations or into the riparian corridor? I know the buffer's intention with respect to the riparian corridor is in some ways to do biofiltration, but I just want to be sure that we feel comfortable that we're not creating a hindrance to the ability of the farmers to run their farm well at the eastern edge of their activity.
I think it would be in the purview of the planning commission to add, could add a condition of approval or request additional information. And we may want to pose the same question to the landscape architect that's here this evening, and he may have some creative solutions for, verifying that, any, fertilizer from the landscaping doesn't, flow into the creek bed. So.
Okay, and one other question, and that was, I know that it looks to me, in my untrained eye, that the cypress and the hedge are linear in nature. It doesn't look like a random pattern. It looks like it was designed as a screen. And I just wonder if we know whether they were put in as part of a coastal development permit. Do we have a permit that identifies that development?
We do, and actually we were able to locate that record, and I don't recall seeing the cypress trees on the landscape plan for the original approval.
This would be the 2001 approval?
2001, yeah.
Yeah, my name's on that, I remember. I used to be a planning commissioner a long time ago. I tell people that I came in as a young tiger and I got reincarnated as an old lion. So I'm trying to shake the fog off.
As a matter of fact, I did bring the plans with me this evening. If you're welcome to take a look.
Okay, great, thank you. So no further questions at this time. Thank you, Rick.
Brian?
Yeah, thank you. So, so I heard in reviewing the staff report, so a trail easement is included in the plans, correct?
Correct.
And that trail easement has been somewhat defined within sort of a 20-foot width area, correct?
Yes. Now, the language that we did include on the condition of approval is that the portion parallel to Pillar Studios Creek would be floating within the 50-foot riparian buffer
Within the
to allow for some flexibility on site design before we actually record the easement.
So has there been any conversations with the Coastal Commission staff or others about just sort of how that easement relates to, say, the presence of ESHA habitat or anything along those lines?
Yes, there's been substantial discussion with the coastal staff on this. And for one, when you look through the allowed uses within the riparian buffer area, one of the allowed listed uses is a trail for recreation purposes. Coastal staff was very adamant on the trail not being within the poison hemlock area. So, and the great news is that the site is large enough to accommodate both the hemlock area and the trail easement. So,
Great, so it's not necessarily included within the,
one additional thing, we did recently receive a positive email. We provided the most recent plans to coastal staff, and they responded with a positive email, encouraging us to move forward with it.
very good, that's great to hear. So, but it's not necessarily the trail, and the development of that trail or that alignment isn't necessarily, how does that relate to the CDP for this site or for the actual coastal permit? I mean, the trail wouldn't be permitted under the Coastal Commission. That would still be something that would be the responsibility of the city, or?
Correct. So the trail itself is not included in this project. It's just the easement, requesting the easement. At a later date, once or if the city decides to move forward with the construction of the Pilocitos Trail, a new coastal development permit application will need to be submitted along with biological resource assessment for that project. And in all likelihood, we would get the Planning Commission involved in that process. So, but not at this, no trail improvements are proposed at this time.
Can I piggyback on his question quickly?
Absolutely.
So the local coastal program policy is that development in Ishas and in areas adjacent will be designed and sited so as not to have an impact. And I think you mentioned, and I get it with respect to the easement along the east side of the property, but there's also that section that you said was on a grade and that there was a likelihood of retaining walls in that area. And so did the Coastal Commission comment, or did it come up about whether that kind of retaining wall activity would be compatible with the biologic productivity of the riparian corridor, or is that just too little? We don't know enough about that yet.
We didn't get into the details of the trail design because it's not proposed at this point. But if or when in the future trail proposal does move forward, we will work closely with not only a biologist but coastal staff on the design of the trail as well as the Planning Commission.
The reason I'm asking is that if it turns out later that it's not feasible, then it seems like we might want to have some backup plan for getting at least as far as Altona in our plan, if you follow my thinking here.
I'm going to chime in a wee bit. This is exactly why we were working on the floating easement approach. The goal is to not have any retaining walls and to manage grade changes with a meander, if need be, to have moderate slopes. So we think there's enough room. It looks feasible. Obviously, we have a lot more to do in terms of design, but we're very mindful of your concern.
I appreciate that. And then last on the easement, recorded in perpetuity, there's no time limit?
Correct. That's our approach on that. So.
Thank you, Rick.
I've got no further questions.
John?
In my packet, there was quite a bit of back and forth with the coastal staff about biological evaluations. Has all of that come to closure, or are there still some open-ended issues that aren't resolved yet?
We believe for this project that it is resolved, but you did notice the discussion about the poison hemlock, We had different opinions from different biologists, which happens from time to time. And what's good about that timing is the city's working on your coastal resources and biological resources portion of the LUP. We'd like to take advantage of that to have more discussion with Coastal Commission staff. We also have a new biologist coming on board to support that project who has some background in this and I think can shed some light on it that will be helpful to the Planning Commission, Council, and staff in both agencies. So there'll be more to come on poison hemlock, and of course it was everywhere this year. It was yeah, quite present. Yeah.
Thank you.
Going back to the Matucci subdivision appeal meeting, I know Jimmy made some comments about the, his communication with Mayor Ruddick. Have we gotten any guidance from City Council as to like their views on the Matucci subdivision, or should we take the minutes from that meeting as sort of a standing policy? I mean, do we have any guidance from either staff or our attorney on how we should interpret the position the City Council took during the appeal meeting? Is a matter of policy.
I mentioned this earlier in the presentation that, it's including our residential design guidelines and policies within the land use plan. So
I'm going to add a little bit more to that as well because I spoke with Stephanie Hall, our attorney here tonight. Despite the attorney's review with staff of the chain of title and all the other details on that agreement, and I cannot speak to how it was handled during or after that City Council meeting, and I've frankly been hearing about the Matucci agreement since we hosted a tent party in Oak Avenue Park in 2015. So I know it's really present in people's minds. What we think is maybe a way to frame it, it's on page 4 of your memo. We recognize as staff that it remains of great interest. As Commissioner Benjamin noted, the intent of the agreement was seeking compatibility in that development. So we would suggest that the Planning Commission regard it as a very useful reference. It's part of your record. It's not a standard like you have in the actual PUD, but I think it gives you some guidance.
And you're specifically referring to J and K as on page 4?
J and K are some of those design requirements that we're asking you to consider, and those two pertain to the site relative to the neighborhood as a whole. This is maybe a little more applicable to the PUD itself, so CG and I. But I think reviewing the agreement, you'll notice that there are site-specific guidances as well as general guidance for the overall development. So it has a degree of what it's approaching in terms of which site is being considered.
So the guidance we're getting from staff is, as we consider that, is to look specifically within the Matucci PUD and not to focus on any of the development to the east. That really wouldn't be.
No, we would like you to think about the entire context of the neighborhood.
Okay.
So, yes, of course, you're going to probably be primarily focused on the PUD because that's where standards are coming from. But the The PUD is a visual resource area, and Chapter 14 of the zoning ordinance brings you these design criteria, including those, for example, this one here, J, I think is really significant for this particular location. The design shall promote harmonious transition in scale and character in areas located between different designated land uses. And then K as well. The design shall be compatible with known and approved improvements and or future construction, both on and off the site. That speaks to the future Pilarcitos Trail, for example.
Great, thank you. I have no further questions, and looks like there's no further questions from the commission, so you'd propose giving us a reading break. I've managed to, I think, read through most of this. I don't know if my fellow commissioners, do you want to take a break? Why don't we just I'll just adjourn for 5 minutes, and we'll come back after folks have had a chance to read through this.
I just want to make sure some people came in a little bit later. We made 15 copies of this. If you need a copy to take a look at this memo, let me know. We have a couple up here that we can share.
Actually, maybe before we break, if we could just have the public, should we do the public forum, or do you want to do the presentation? What is
I think we should. I would really like to give the applicant a chance to read the memo and make their presentation. They're prepared for that, and that will give the public an advantage of having heard all of the presentation.
Okay.
If that's okay.
That's fine. So let's adjourn for we'll call it 5 minutes. All right. So let's get started again. Gonna reopen the planning commission meeting. For the record, Commissioner Benjamin reviewed the earlier plans and noted that there's no landscaping plan on the original plans.
Well, in my limited understanding of plans, I saw some notional,
In your cursory review.
yes, I saw some, what like ornamentals adjacent to the house, but I didn't see anything like what's at the eastern edge of the, at the site.
Okay, so the applicant has a presentation. Would you like to go ahead and please
Yes.
make sure
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Bruce Chan. I'm a land planner and licensed landscape architect. May I ask staff to put up one of the aerial slides? Next one, please. Perfect. Great. Thank you. I was not at the September 2016 Planning Commission meeting, but I was able to review the notes and watch the video. I appreciate that staff has done a very thorough report. The lot, as you see in your packages, is 66,000 plus square feet. With an FAR of 35%, that would yield a square footage of 23,000 plus square feet. And of course, the applicant is asking for much less than that. They're asking for 7,945. Coupled with the existing structure brings us to over 8,000 square feet. That's still less than 40% of the maximum allowable FAR. As you can see by the slide in front of you, the house footprint is small in relationship to the size of the lot. It was reduced from the September meeting by about 10% in footprint size. So it went from 106 to 94, and the depth went from 66 down to 56. The building is 2 stories throughout. I didn't show the driveway on this, but the driveway would encompass the existing driveway and extend to the garage area. We had previously proposed this to be all concrete, impervious surface, and as staff pointed out, we would do this in unit pavers, permeable paving materials.
Excuse me, is your microphone turned green?
Yes, it is green.
Great, thank you. If you could speak closer to it,
I
I
should
think.
probably just hold it like this, right?
Thank
Okay. Where was I? So the architect made several changes to the building design. It doesn't have the grand staircase, as staff pointed out. There were changes made in the plane of the structures to give it more variation, and also some stone facade material placed at various parts of the building. The roof is going to be a gray slate, as you can see on the panel, the material board here. When we talk about in materials and the colors of the building, the stone, when we think about the visual impact, very much depends on color and scale. As I mentioned, the building is 2 stories tall throughout. However, the building is also going to be a earth tone taupe color. If we go back a couple of slides, Scott, if you don't mind. Go back to one of your own slides. Yes, that one. So you'll notice that the 2 houses to the right have white walls and one has a red roof. By choosing more natural colors, the gray, the taupe or brown, for our proposed house, we think it would have a low visual impact, albeit it is 2 stories again. As Jill mentioned, we do have existing cypress trees on 2 sections of the lot. Scott, could you go to another slide of mine? Right, so yeah, go back one, please. Great. So along that L shape of green vegetation you see, those are mostly all cypress trees. And they're not in a row, they're actually staggered. The 10-foot wide trail easement that goes along the easternmost portion of the lot about 60 to 70% of those trees are outside of that easement, which means that about 30% would need to be removed. That would still allow for vegetation screening between the existing houses to the east and the proposed house. One of the things that we could do with the house plans that you have before you is we could reduce the height by 2 feet, bringing it from 28 down to 26, which would be less than the 27-foot height that some of the neighboring houses have. The landscape plan includes non-invasive plant material. And by the way, just as a side note, and I know this is splitting hairs, but the plant that was listed before that the biologists identified as invasive is actually not invasive. A lot of people make that, a lot of professionals make that mistake. So what the nurseries did was they went and changed the variety name so it wouldn't be mistaken with the one that's on the invasive species list. That was the Pennisetum, the fountain grass, by the way. Do you have any questions for me? Or you can ask me questions during your discussion portion. I'd be happy to answer it. But in a nutshell, that's about it.
Do you have questions, John? I had a question in terms of the design. I noticed in the original design that was discussed back in, or the plans that were originally submitted, the primary residence was directly to the west of the secondary structure, and you've in the new plan you've moved the house to the south.
Yes.
And you know, I'm curious about, you know, the decision to do that, especially in light of, you know, the idea that this is a visual corridor.
Right.
And you're sort of increasing the obstruction in the visual corridor, and I wonder what the thinking is around that.
Well, there's two ways to look at that. One is to not spread out your development and cluster it together so that you do leave more open vistas. The other thing that we wanted to do was to stay further away from the buffer zones and the trail easement.
Okay. I've opened up some questions here, Brian.
Yeah, so I'm looking at your landscape plan here, and looking at to the aerial there, and the limit of work really is just to, I guess, what would be the north of the existing house there, and really staying out of that buffer zone and that sort of thing. Is there any plans for any additional landscaping improvements, anything sort of within that buffer area or beyond that to the north of that area?
So as you'll see in your packets on sheet L 1.1, there is a wildlife fence, and that's the demarcation. It runs, I don't remember the exact footage or the exact distance, but it's probably about 20 feet away or so from, maybe 25 feet away from the house, and that would be the line of demarcation between active landscaping and the natural landscaping, and the trail easement too.
So there would be a fence separating basically the active landscape, that other area.
Correct.
What's the nature of that fence? Is that like a split rail or?
Yes, that shows on sheet L 1.2 of your packets, and it's a wildlife-friendly fence that we use in forest work for just that purpose, to allow wildlife to go through.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think we have a slide of that, but it should be in your packets again.
Yeah, it's in
Right.
L1 too.
Yeah, and that fence runs along the entire, it separates us from the easement for the entire length through the property. But of course, it does not extend to the western parcel, which the applicant doesn't own.
So this would be, I guess, a comment that I would potentially make later, but just asking now, was there any consideration for, I know this is a wildlife friendly fence and that allows wildlife movement, but was there any consideration for sort of domesticated animal blockages along there? Something that would keep cats out of the riparian areas along those lines? I know that's an issue in a number of different.
No, there wasn't. You know, cats will jump a 6-foot-high fence, so.
Well, you're right.
Where you going with this?
Had to ask.
Yeah.
Okay. John?
Mr. Tanner, are you like an interpreter tonight for the building designer, or how's that going to work? If we
The
have
building
questions
architect
about
couldn't be here, so he and I met over the last week or so, and we went over particulars of the design. That's why I'm able to offer a 2-foot height reduction in the building height, and again, in discussing about the different planes of the building, the colors of the building, I'm repeating what he and I have talked about.
And you say he's an architect? Is that, it's not identified on the drawings here? Is he?
No, he isn't. No, I'm sorry.
I'm just asking questions, you know, who.
So he belongs to a firm. The person I met with was the project manager. His name is Derek, and he was the one who was here in September. The project architect, his name is John Chow, and the company's name is ICE Design.
And are they licensed in California, or they just call themselves architects?
No, they're licensed.
Oh, great, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
John Chow. I think it's CHOW if you want to look it up. Oh, Jeff Chow. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
They're also engineers.
Jimmy?
Yeah, okay, so a couple of questions for you, and I understand if you are limited in your familiarity to what you talked about with your colleague, and if the answer is you don't know or we'll have to get back to it, I don't want to put you on the spot, but so when I noticed that there was a reference in the document for material sort of at the southeastern end of the site, if I understood it right. That's a little different from the broader staging area process during construction. It's been my experience that a vague definition of staging area is an invitation for environmental disaster because the contractors don't necessarily pay assiduous detail attention to what we talk about and where the buffers are, and we end up with tractors dripping oil into buffers or issues or running over habitat. So is there anything in this plan that identifies the staging areas?
Not in your current packet, but what you could do is you could get condition and approval based on the applicant submitting a plan, a construction management plan that's acceptable to staff, that follows BMPs, that sort of thing.
Yeah, actually, from my perspective, we can't make the findings that it doesn't have an impact until we know where it is. My understanding of CEQA is that we actually have to see the mitigation before we can say it's sufficient, as opposed to, yeah, we'll work it out. So that's a standard that I hope we'll adopt with more frequency. I asked a question at the beginning of the hearing about the drainage plan. And I understand that from staff's perspective, they think that the catchment basin could hold a 10-year storm event. But of course, we know that, or at least we have a lot of peer-reviewed evidence in the record that climate change is happening and bigger storms happen, and the impacts are potentially adverse. Can you tell me if that catchment basin is indeed 10 years or hopefully it's much larger?
I do not know what event it is designed for.
Okay. You had mentioned the intention of using taupe or gray to reduce the impact of the mass. You were acknowledging that it's bigger than the other ones, but...
Not the mass, but the visual perception.
Yeah, the perception of the mass. I'm sorry. Thank you.
So for instance, if you were to look...
I got it.
Okay.
So my only question was, is there anything in the CC&Rs that requires the continuous use of those kind of earth tones that would be binding on future owners, or could the property be sold to somebody who thinks that barn red is a great color?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. I guess I'd like to hear from the public. I may have some more questions, but I think the public's been really patient, and I apologize for monopolizing the time.
I just had one more question, which is going back to the siting of the new residence. as you guys went through this, as part of the design process, there's a proposal to put in a public trail to the north. What kind of thinking has gone into the design and privacy and screening of the house in relation to the public trail? I mean, I wouldn't be super thrilled to have a bunch of folks walking by my living room. So I'm just curious as to what your thinking is, and I didn't really see anything in the landscape plan that really addressed that.
So, you know, it's interesting because Jill was just speaking earlier about screening of the development from the Coastal Commission standpoint. And I know that the owner, she and I have talked about this, is that she would like to make the easement secure. That really isn't possible given the kind of fencing that we need to have, the wildlife fencing. In terms of the screening, we do have groups of shrubs and smaller trees that are randomly or irregularly laid out along the easement in the planting plan. It's not a hedge, however. So at points, the house and the trail will be visible to users of the trail and occupants of the house.
I'd like to direct a question back to staff in terms of screening. I mean, the intention, well, my interpretation of the intention from a visual resource perspective is you're typically trying to look out to the ocean or look from the ocean up to the foothills. Is a north to south screening between the trail and the house an area of concern, like an area of concern for the Coastal Commission? If they choose to put up a hedge, is that going to be an issue in that area? I mean, have we talked to the Coastal Commission about it? Because I agree with the concern about privacy, and you know, it's I think not an unreasonable thing to consider and to clarify up front, as opposed to waiting to 10 years from now.
So I'm going to give you an answer that you might not like. I think this is in your discretion with regards to the PUD as a visual resource area and how you implement that landscaping. We don't have a specific zoning reference to north to south views as you just described, but you also have a riparian corridor. And so I think working through the discussion with, of course, you have a landscape architect in the room, which is quite helpful, and giving staff a few cues on this so that we can work with them as well would be helpful to us.
May I ask staff to pull up that slide that you prepared of the view from the coastal trail easement back toward the hills? Right. It's unfortunate that the view doesn't extend to the left and right more. So we were talking about the house being located on the southern portion of the parcel. If the house were moved more toward the left, what would that do? And I apologize if it, or I hope you'll indulge me by thinking out loud. I think what you would see is you would see the trees off to the right there, the cypress trees, and those trees would actually stay. And there is room to shift the house. However, the house also becomes more prominent in view of the coastal trail, because if you remember the alignment of the coastal trail, if you were walking toward the east on the coastal trail, that house would be more in your direct view. If you think of your cone of vision, well, when you're walking, your head moves around. If you're driving, you really have about a 2% cone of vision. But if you were to think about walking, say, a distance of 300 feet, and the house is moved to the left, it would really be right in front of you if you move the house more to the north. It's just something for you to consider.
I think it's an interesting thought exercise. It would also screen the other house, though, if it was moved to the left, or the other residence part of the project. So
it would screen. I'm sorry. It would screen.
So I can see the guest residence.
Right.
So if the house actually moved to the left,
yeah.
Yes, you would. Maybe the house would be more prominent, but you would screen the existing guest residence, so you reduce the overall visual impact.
Yeah, the existing guest residence is 1 story. And visually it has a fairly low impact right now. It's, again, earth tone colors, the roof is gray, as opposed to white or red.
Through the chair, the only concern I have about that, and I'm not sure, but I'd want to see where the northern edge of the house is with respect to the wetland buffer.
Right.
Because if it's right at it, then you don't really get to shift it. Because it's not, our zoning ordinance prohibits intrusion into those buffers when there's a feasible building area. And of course, in this case, it doesn't have to be this big. I understand it's the preference of the applicant.
Well, I guess that's on L1 too. So if we look at,
Scott, could we look at that slide again? The aerial view with all the way down Jenna Lane? The next one? Great, thank you.
or you wanted to point something out?
Well, I was just going to say in response to what you were saying, that riparian area is right along, and it does come into the property, but it's right along that right-hand side property line.
Excuse me, it's not the riparian area, it's the wetland buffer.
Wetland buffer, correct, I'm sorry.
So Scott had a slide up that was showing the 100-foot buffer from the hemlock. And can you pop that back up? We think this is the predominant force that caused the shift of the footprint of this home.
That's the black?
Yep, that's the heavy dashed line. And it's skimming the edge of the house under the eave.
All right. I'd like to, unless you have any other questions, I'd like to go ahead and open up for public comment. Thank you for your presentation. So again, we've got four public comment cards. If you haven't filled a card out, you can go ahead and speak, and we ask that you please consider filling out a comment card after the fact. So I'd like to open it up to Zhushan Feng. Followed by Paul Gregoriev.
My name is Xueshan Feng. I live next door, 28 Jina Lane. So I feel I have some responsibilities here. I really have to speak. I was here in last September hearing as well. I presented some pictures, numbers. So for the record, for the number here, there are some blanks in here, this page. So my house, the height is actually 24.5 feet, so it's not 27. It's much lower than the rest of the house in that Jina Lane because of the Machusi agreement limited that the house has to be lower than 24. I mean, maximum is 24.5. And also, not only that, the second floor is limited to 700 square feet only. So the whole house footage is 3,580, something like that. So it's very dwarfed. If you go to by the way, you are welcome to go to my backyard and take a look. I don't mind. It's just to go in. There's no gate, no locking, and to take a look. I speak the lady already, the owner, so I really feel sorry about all these troubles, but still, when a house is built, it's many years to come, right? You cannot really redo it. So, I wish we could do it right. So that's the size compatibility issue. And the other thing I really appreciate this time, the size is reduced by 300 some square foot, and they moved also a little bit further from my home. I didn't go measure, but they did move a little bit, so there's some more distance in there, but still, because of the size of the whole building, it doesn't feel much actually have changed. So that's my concern, basically. And the balcony on the second floor look directly into my backyard. I don't have jacuzzi and swimming pool, so it probably is otherwise to be really bad. And if then anything can be changed, or some conditions, some screening can be done, I really appreciate if they can make some modifications. That would be good for both houses, right? You know, privacy is both sides. It's not just me. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. So Paul, followed by Mike Ferrara.
I guess that's okay. Am I coming through okay here? Good evening. My name is Paul Grigoriev, and I live here in Half Moon Bay. I'm here tonight to ask that your honorable commission, together with the city council, do whatever you can to right a wrong that occurred almost 17 years ago. That was when the so-called Matucci Agreement, which is attachment number 7 in tonight's packet, and you've seen the slide briefly, was negotiated in good faith and under city council auspices between neighbors and the original developer of the property at 32 Janet Lane. Indeed, individuals in the room tonight witnessed the signing of this agreement. The neighbors strongly objected to the developer's plans to wall off his development, creating a gated community and blocking their views of a precious resource, the ocean side. They also negotiated limits on the height and size of the planned homes, again trying to reserve their viewscape. Sadly, however, the neighborhood residents, excited by their apparent success, did not record their hard-won agreement in legally proper fashion. The result was that the developer claimed the agreement was, quote, not worth the paper it was printed on, tore it up, and refused to honor its provisions. Planning and code enforcement staff of the city of Half Moon Bay have also ignored the agreement in the past. Tonight, however, you have before you a chance to right this historic wrong. Tonight, another developer seeks a permit that would violate several provisions of the original agreement. Specifically, the roofs of homes on lots 1 and 2 shall not exceed 22 feet in height. Fences facing east shall be of open design, no more than 4 feet in height. No trees or shrubs are to exceed 7 feet in height in the view corridors between any of the houses. And finally, no fencing along the trail easement to the east side may block the view from the easement, and California state law considers a row of trees or a hedge to be the same as a fence. The present application provides your commission an opportunity to attach conditions that will respect the goals of the Matucci Agreement concerning the development of the property at 32 Jenna Lane and validate the assurances made by the City Council to the neighbors 17 years ago. To further this aim, I'd also like to endorse tonight the continuation of this item. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Mike Farrar, followed by Matt Berman.
Good evening, Commissioners, staff. Somewhere in your packet, there's the 2001 permit signed by myself as the chair of the Planning Commission at that time. I've gone back and reviewed it just to make sure that my memory was correct. And it is. There is a condition in there for a 100-foot setback from the riparian corridor that was directly negotiated with the developer. There are other cookie-cutter conditions that reflect the standard that didn't get changed, but that one condition is in there, the 100-foot riparian setback. That was brought forward by Commissioner Conroy in the September hearing. I don't know if that just got missed or if it has somehow been invalidated, but that was a conscious part of the 2001 permit. And I remember very clearly talking to the developer and explaining to him that there's slopes there, that, you know, it doesn't hurt him. He's not going to put a lawn there. Why not? That's more protective of the resources. And so that's why it's there. I do support a continuance as presented by staff. I appreciate a lot of the stuff that staff has been doing on this because it's complicated. And I think that the residents have been remarkably restrained, all things considered, because I was a witness to the developer smirking as he told them that the agreement wasn't worth the paper it was written on. So thank you for all of your good comments and questions, and I really do hope that we can restore that buffer. So thank you.
She's handing out a packet right now that goes along with I've been frantically revising what I was going to say based on the new staff report. Good evening. My name is Matt Berman. My property borders the property in question, along with 3 others for whom I speak tonight. I have letters from them saying that I speak for them, as well as for the homeowners association that borders this development. Also wanted to mention real quickly, I have video of the city council meeting where the Matucci agreement was accepted, where the council members were discussing how can we set this in concrete, was the quote from them. So it makes very clear their intention was that it was supposed to guide future development. Anyway, I would also like to say that I support the recommendation to continue. I feel like the new report is showing real progress. The packet you were just given includes a list of the codes and ordinances that are currently violated on this property and that the development plan should include remedies for, letters from some of the other residents, and on top some pictures showing the relative sizes and styles of the proposed house and its neighbors. Here's what we're asking for. Approval of this project should include, oops, I forgot to stop my stopwatch here, should include conditions that remedy the violations of the codes and ordinances you'll find in the packet we gave you, including the removal of all hedges and trees that violate the codes and plans in that packet. We'd like the house to be limited to 6,000 square feet with a roof line no higher than 22 feet. The guest house is not supposed to be more than 700 square feet. And when it does, we won't have any objection to the owner building what will still be the biggest house in the area. Paul addressed the Matucci agreement. I want to talk about the law, including the specific plans, CDP, zoning ordinances, and local, county, state codes and guidelines. That packet has the details. In my brief speaking time, I'm going to address a few items, some of which have already been addressed in the staff report, so I'll try to jump over them. It says in the report that the new residence is similar to other sizes. I hope the pictures that I included there show whether it really is similar. This similar house is 133% bigger than the next largest house, 170% bigger than the average size of the Matucci tract houses, and 548% bigger than our houses that are next door. Let's see, I crossed all that out. The new design is slightly smaller than the previous one, 345 square feet. My calculator says that's 4% smaller, not 10% smaller. The open space coastal requirements of the specific plan, which say that a minimum of 80% of the lot, not 65, will be devoted to private open space on all lots. That doesn't justify the size of the house. That's talking about open space. By that reasoning, the first floor of the house could be more than 13,000 square feet and 26,000 square feet with a second floor. That's not what the open space requirements are addressing. The open space doesn't include the driveway, the second cottage, the yard, all the rest of it. The 80% requirement of open space doesn't mean they get to fill the rest of the lot with house. Some of the violations you'll see on your sheet involve the planting of hedge and fast-growing trees that block all public and private views of the coast. They will also be blocking the views from the trail easement, should a trail ever be put in there. The proposed plan specifically calls for the preservation of these recent illegal fast-growing trees and hedges when it should actually do the opposite and call for their removal. I appreciate that the staff report addressed the reasoning that because those trees were blocking the view, therefore it didn't really matter what the house looked like, so I'm glad that that's been addressed. It's our hope that you will attach conditions that will address and remedy all of the concerns there in your packet and the ones that people have spoken here today about too. Thank you.
Thank you. If anybody else has any comments they'd like to share, I invite you to step up. Not seeing anybody, I'm going to close public comments. I'd like to just redirect back to staff, and particularly our attorney. don't believe you've probably had a chance to look at any of these items. With respect to the assertion on open space and the 80% rule, and does that or does that not include driveways? I know we've had a number of, in previous sessions, discussions about open space as it pertains to properties. Do you have any comments on the open space piece and how much of the property should be set aside, or is this something where you probably want to take some time and look at this a little later?
We would appreciate some time. That was pretty quick and thorough, and thank you for submitting it in writing. We really appreciate that.
Okay, I'm going to open it up for discussion with my fellow commissioners. Okay, John?
So before I talk about the build, well, first of all, I'm glad the owners are here. It's nice that you're here this evening. Thank you. Neighbors, I'm sorry. So it's just the landscape architect. Thank you. I'm sorry. So thank you. Oh, if that's the only thing I get wrong, I'm in good shape tonight, right?
Only one for one.
Yeah, right.
We're glad you're here anyway.
So just a question about the permits themselves. If are we going to need some kind of exception or something of our own ordinance for the accessory building?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So, oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was talking to. So are we going to need? So this is just a question of the permitting. Are we going to need in the conditions of approval or findings some exception to our own ordinance about second units or accessory buildings because of the size of the building that's there now?
So the existing building on the site actually conforms to our current regulations for accessory dwelling units. So, yeah, it doesn't exceed 700 square feet of living space, and it does meet the setbacks. The missing piece is the deed restriction. So it is required to, a deed restriction needs to be recorded before we can issue a certificate of occupancy for the new house and the converted accessory dwelling unit.
Okay, so I just misread in my packet that it was 1,100 square feet, the existing building.
That includes the garage, but the maximum allowed square footage for the accessory dwelling unit does not include the garage.
Okay, great, thank you. And then also, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of slow moving here. So you made reference that we need to approve the negative deck and this environmental impact before we do anything else?
That's correct. So you, if the commission is comfortable with making a motion to approve the project, adopting the mitigated negative declaration would need to take place before approving the project. So.
How does it work when we make suggestions or requirements to change the project without, does that document also have to change? How does that work?
No, unless the scope of the project changes, which would require additional mitigation measures, then we could be looking at modifying and recirculating the environmental document.
Thank you.
Brian?
So I'm primarily interested in the area of the property that's within the buffer zone that's outside of the development area, adjacent to the creek, that would be part of the trail buffer and presumably managed as habitat protected as habitat, and just wanting to know and needing some assurance that as privately owned open space that would continue to be managed as natural habitat, and sort of what sort of standards could be built in there that would ensure that those are managed. And I don't necessarily expect a response to that now, but to the extent that there's some level of long-term management plan or conservation easement or something like that could or should be applied to that land. And really, ultimately, I think, we're being asked to stretch a bit here. We're looking at a larger home size than the neighborhood, looking at a higher height size, and really just a number of different things. And my gut reaction is that there should be sort of a corresponding response to the applicant that they should stretch a bit too, and perhaps provide a higher level of public benefit through that area for, I appreciate the trail easement, but above and beyond that, I'm just worried about sort of how that really gets implemented, really ultimately what, the shifting of burden becomes, and that the city would ultimately be responsible for the development of that trail within an area of sensitive habitat, and does the city then take on the burden of permitting and everything else in that area, and then the long-term management and maintenance of that area is something that to me is an unknown, and just something that is a concern. It's kind of a black hole, I guess, out there. So that's really my biggest comment, is just the future fate of, I guess, what has been referred to as the private open space, but more predominantly the private open space within the protected areas, the areas within the buffer zones, and that type of thing. So just sort of what design standards, management standards, habitat performance, protection assurances, and just really making sure that the city can actually move forward feasibly with what is a goal in the general plan and elsewhere of developing a trail somewhat through that area. So that's my primary comment right now.
Jimmy? Sure. So I've been chewing on this for a few days and trying to identify a framework for thinking about it. And I really appreciate the supplemental staff report as well as the original staff work. But the supplements really call out some important policies that should be guiding our thinking beyond the standard. What do we think the specific plan calls for, in addition to the items in that 2-page specific plan, which is sparse. There's a reference to Chapter 18 standards, and they make a reference to the design standards in Title 14 of the Municipal Code. And I think it's worthwhile to point out, as staff did, that we know that this is a PUD, and that makes it a visual resource in its own right. So independently of whether you can see through to the water or look back to the mountains, it's a visual resource. And the idea is that we were trying to make it fit in and work out in the context of existing development in that neighborhood. That's what you try to do. And the conversations I had with Mr. Berman and also with Mayor Ruddick made it clear to me that the public and the developers spent a lot of time hashing out what constituted design compatibility. And I think that the bona fide intention of the city was that we should do that that we're willing to endorse what they agreed to. They got together, they knocked their heads together, they found something that worked. And I understand that the city hasn't said that it's already binding. However, we have the authority, in fact, we have the obligation to make it work. And we absolutely have the authority to impose those conditions on a permit-by-permit basis where it's feasible to do so. We don't have to look at it and say, we need to amend the specific plan. We can look at this development and the development of the remaining parcels that are not developed and say, these are the things that represent the community's values for how this fits in and works out, and we can impose those conditions. And to the extent that they're feasible, I think we should. So, in particular, there are policies concerning height, bulk, and design that were resolved by the public and the developer. And the cover for us to do that is in Title 14. I think it was called out in the staff report. That's it's chapter 14.37.035G. And 030B in the same area says requirements can be more restrictive in order to ensure compatibility with surroundings. There was a reference in the text to the need for harmonious transitions between land uses. And in this case, the land uses we're talking about are the lower house to the south of this building site, the accessory dwelling unit, which is, I believe, at 16 feet, the riparian corridor, the farmland, and the multifamily residential. None of those gets up big like this house. So it doesn't feel to me at its current height that it works. And the public's value, as agreed with the developer at the time this specific plan was developed, was that 22 feet was a good height. I think 22 feet is a good height. I also think that with respect to drainage, let me just talk with respect to bulk. This house is substantially larger than the other houses. At the time this specific plan was developed, if memory serves, and maybe former Mayor Ferreira can correct me if I'm wrong, when we computed floor area ratios, we started by excluding the areas that were riparian corridors or otherwise undevelopable. That then once we found the area that was developable, then we computed a floor area ratio. And a subsequent city council changed the way they did that calculation, so they started with a much larger denominator for that fraction. And so I think it's important to understand the context, because I don't think they envisioned something quite this large. And that's one of the reasons that the 2001 home, with a developer who knew how to push the envelope pretty well, settled for a home of 6,000 and something square feet. I'm seeing an interruption.
I apologize, but I have a question of the commission because I'm learning your code inside out. And this came up today. I'm familiar with codes where FAR is calculated with or without the kinds of spaces you've discussed. And I asked staff if it was computed based on gross or net site area. And what I'm wondering now is if the FAR definition was different when the Matucci agreement, or when the specific plan was adopted.
I believe so, but that was going to be my question to you.
Okay,
So
that's
I
fair.
don't know the answer.
We'll
Well,
find out.
I can't cite chapter and
It's-
verse, but we
it's
should know.
Really important. Okay, thank you.
And this is a question for the attorney. I don't know the answer yet, or even think I know, but there was a recent Supreme Court decision, this is the Lynch decision, in which a developer received the rights to do some development, and then after they did their development, they came back and wanted to do some additional work. To make a long story short, the Supreme Court said, you got the benefit of your permit, so you're not supposed to be able to do more. Now, I don't remember the specifics of the 2001 permit, and I acknowledge that the main house was withdrawn. If the 2001 permit permitted both the accessory dwelling unit and the main house, and they only withdrew the main house, they got a benefit. And the question is, what is our obligation to provide more, if any? Or are we well within our rights on the basis of the Lynch decision to say, if you want to build something that's the same dimension as that other thing, maybe that's okay, but asking for more is asking for more than you accepted in the original bargain. So I'm not presupposing I know the answer, but I think it's worth understanding it. And I think it's a benefit to the applicant as well. With respect to drainage, I appreciate staff's offer to look at, and the applicant representative offer to understand where we are with respect to drainage. I'm concerned that a 10-year storm is not adequate capture because storms are getting, the variants of storms are getting much larger, and this is adjacent to an extremely sensitive habitat. We know it has endangered species. We know it can represent a potential for flooding downstream. And if there are a lot of chemicals used to maintain the lawn, that's a potential challenge. I don't know what the fire plan will be. We historically have an issue in Half Moon Bay where development happens and vegetation, the house is sort of close to the edge, and then in the name of fire safety, vegetation is removed from the buffer area. And I want to be sure that doesn't happen. I think I remember a condition about that, but I'd like to double check to be sure. I want to speak to Commissioner Ferreira's, former Mayor Ferreira, excuse me, concern about the riparian buffer that my predecessor, former Commissioner Conroy, identified. My understanding is that that the wetland buffer goes actually deeper into the parcel than the riparian area buffer would. However, that may not be for the entire parcel. And in any event, it doesn't hurt to identify both buffers, since that was a request of the previous holder of this seat. I want to carry his concern forward and make sure that both buffers are there. And if there is a CC&R, I don't know if you have those for individual lots or whether they happen for just for subdivisions. It makes sense that those things would be identified that way. I know I had a couple of others, but I'm going to shut up for now and give the very patient chair a chance to voice his concerns.
Thank you, sir. So, I think we should probably remove any suspense. I think we're probably all try to remove any suspense here. I think we're probably going to go for continuation on this project. So I'd like to make sure, I see nods of ascension from my commissioners. I'd like to make sure that we get all the major issues addressed. I do think we should look at mapping the wetland buffer as called out. I have to say I've seen a lot of thoughtful projects that really try to fit into the neighborhood, fit into the community. I don't believe this project does that. I think that there's been some documentation put into the public record that we can all take a look at and verify if the scales are accurate. But I think it comments not just within the PUD, but within the surrounding neighborhood. This is a very large project, so it's a concern. I recognize that while the agreement was never memorialized or properly followed through, I think we can use that as a reference document. And my feedback or suggestion is that we use that as a reference document and a guideline for the specific project and for the project that's from the lot that has not been developed. That'd be my we've talked about guidance. Development on the coast is it's particularly important, and we really need to think through the impact to the visual resources. In particular, while we do have concerns about the wetland corridor and the riparian corridor and the setbacks for those, I'm actually interested in the view towards the ocean, the open space, so the east to west views, the extent to which the property could potentially be sited to promote that view. And, I think that's something that should be considered. It's my personal feedback. I am concerned about in effect, the private screening that's grown up there. It's pretty high vegetation, and I don't know if there's some kind of action the city could take at this point to just get that, get that brought back into conformance with, with the Matucci agreement, certainly within code within the city, because it is a visual resource. So I think that's something that should be looked at. I think the 22 feet, we've had some back and forth on this project, but the original project was proposed at 22 feet. My inclination is to go back to the original agreement. I think that with respect to the north to south screening, I think it's really important that the project have screening for privacy, and I think we should, as a commission, can allow that, because both between the next door neighbor's house and the trail that's proposed, I think it's a reasonable thing, and I think it would probably make everybody feel a little more comfortable when the project's completed. I think that that covers. I mean, I do like the idea of and I'm not sure if it's in our purview to set a CCR on the project and say you can't paint your house a certain color. I mean, maybe we can, but given the variation within Jenna Lane, I'm not sure that's something we should be worrying about. I just think we should be focused more on the size and scale of the project as opposed to what color their house is. I mean, I do appreciate taupe or something that blends in, and we can discuss colors as a commission. The other thing that I'd consider, and I think is as you look at this design, there is a long-term plan to have a trail go next to the property. There's actually an existing trail in the park immediately abutting the property. To me, I think this plan should incorporate the trail into the design. You have to put in sidewalks if you build a house on a corner lot. I think we should treat this the same way we treat a sidewalk. That we should consider if we can actually have the trail built in as part of the project and have a design for it, so that we don't have to worry about this in 5 years, 10 years. I think it's something we should consider. That one is a little different, and I'm curious as to what my fellow commissioners think about asking that the design, at the very least, the trail be designed, if not required, as a condition of approval.
So I like the idea of beginning with the end in mind, and your insight about how the trail that sort of parallels the riparian corridor but is outside it plays out. The existing trail is pretty far into the buffer area, whereas this trail is at the exterior edge of the buffer area, and there's a rolling buffer concept that maybe we should ask Jill to remind us how that concept worked. But we need to plan for the transition of that, and I think that is an important consideration. I'm really glad you brought up the shrubs and cypress trees, and the interest in making that, developing consistence with the agreement between the developers and the neighbors. I'm hopeful, I do have questions, maybe reservations about whether their installation was a permitted use. I love trees, I like to see them, but when you put them in a visual resource area with these impacts, you can see how it might raise issues that you wouldn't have if you were restoring a riparian corridor or something like that. As for vertical separation, north to south separation, one of the challenges there is that if we use trees like cypress trees, when they go in, they're small and they'll get tall in a hurry. but they also tend to bulk out and create an impact that would impact your view looking west or looking east. So creative approaches to how we might achieve those buffers, and doing it in a way that doesn't create a very tall impact, even if it's a tree. I've seen cypresses that get very tall and they look a little out of character. I agree with you that I prefer your approach with respect to height and bulk as opposed to managing color. So I'm very comfortable with that approach. But I would like to hear more about, maybe we can all benefit from a review of the rolling easement model, because if we're going to begin with the end in mind, we need to understand how the rolling easement integrates with that end.
Is that something we should cover now, or is that a later?
I'd like to bring something better. I've been staring at that aerial. You'll notice that the path in Oak Avenue Park sort of terminates where there's a little tuck-in parking area. The good news there is, that's a city park, it's a city right-of-way, and it abuts the property for quite an extent. So there's some options for where to tap that connection at that point.
Well, I would just, in general, would support that sort of concept, and I say that in both. I think it's to the benefit of both the city and the property owner, and that ultimately they'll have an interest in how that trail's designed, where it goes, how it operates, and all that sort of stuff. So, to the extent that we can look at that and consider that now, and ultimately, if we could include it in any coastal commission approvals or any other permitting, really facilitates it. So to the extent that we can wrap that in as one project, I think it's something that I would support. I recognize that might have, other implications in terms of CEQA and that sort of thing, but to the extent that we can sort of thread that needle, I would support that.
Yeah, if I could just touch on, follow up on that last comment. Adding a trail to the project scope would require additional biological work and modifying the CEQA document and in all likelihood recirculating for comments. Just so the commission's aware of the the additional work that would need to go into this before, frankly, before the commission could take a look at this again at a public forum. So.
But it's fair to say that that work would need to be done at some point regardless, correct?
Another thing that the commission should really take into consideration is there a nexus between the construction of the house and the trail construction? So.
I'm sorry, what do you mean by that? Yeah, I
That's right. I mean, does
Thank you.
Is there an equal benefit to the developer as well as the community?
Yeah, I'm given the back and forth we've already done on this, I'm a little concerned about putting a burden on the developer for the additional environmental cost. I mean, I would ask the city if this is something that's already planned, if the city could consider, does the city pick up part or all of the tab for, evaluating the trail? I don't, obviously you guys have different budgeting issues, but if it's something that's already going to be planned, to consider that. I know it's sort of outside of our purview, obviously.
Through the chair?
Yep.
So one other item. I mean, I think, a middle ground between having a completely defined plan and ignoring it for the present would be just to have us do kind of risk management and say, here's a range of spaces, in which we could operate the trail, and, maybe there's a lower level of planning effort and expense that has a closer nexus because it allows us to proceed with confidence on approving the application and being able to make the finding that we're not going to impact coastal access without asking for dotted i's and crossed t's. So maybe a way to deal with that. The other thing is that, and I sincerely hope that the applicant will consider, if they're open to the idea of dropping the hedge and the cypress at the east boundary, that gives them potentially some really good solar access, actually in several places. And I hope that they'll consider, I know that staff presented several alternatives of how to make the house more sustainably, environmentally sustainable. And it seems like, you know, with all the western exposure, they could have an incredible solar access already, but maybe they get more without some of the really tall trees casting a shadow and limiting solar gain. Maybe not, but I'm hopeful that it will at least come up. So that I think I've exhausted myself.
I'm exhausted.
So it seems like we have 90% talking about regulations and 10% talking about the building itself. So it's typical of all our projects here, sadly for me. So I'm assuming that changes we make to the zoning regulations, heights, setbacks, lot coverage, they're kind of arbitrary, and it'll be the commission. I don't want to. What I'm going to talk about with the building is going to apply no matter what we decide in terms of if the height is X or Y or Z. And I guess through you, I appreciate. So our concerns in September with the basic plan of the building were, from my point of view, three things. One was that there was a huge space downstairs that was covered facing west, and it was going to be kind of like an Ames research wind tunnel in there, just full of clutter and stuff. So that was a concern. Another concern we had was the grandioseness of the kind of stairway going up to a mid-level entrance. And then a concern of mine was just the general site planning and building design that was really not as energy efficient as it could be. And I really appreciate that the owners addressed two of those concerns. It's very nice, and I appreciate very much that they did that. And I understand, and so I'm going to make a few comments just technically about the building that I think are kind of issues that maybe they've figured out and maybe they haven't yet. Downstairs is a large open space, and with the height that they've given of the size of the floor joist between, I don't see how they're going to be able to build it with this much openness without some columns or large beams or something like that. So it's not going to look exactly like this, and they may be aware of that. And similarly, the stairway that's laid out there, they may have trouble with that getting through the building department. So that, look at that. Suggestions that I would make that I don't expect we're going to make demands. I think it would be really nice if they would consider putting a small Lula elevator. That's a limited occupancy, limited use elevator in this building. It's fairly small. It's big enough for a wheelchair, not big enough for a gurney. And they talk about it as a family estate, and I don't know, when I get hurt and I can't walk very well, I've got my grandchild in tow, you know, a stairway is kind of a problem. So that, and it's relatively inexpensive. The garage depth is only 20 feet. I would suggest they seriously look at making that deeper, regardless of how big it makes the building. Unless you're driving Mini Coopers and stuff, most cars today will barely fit in this garage, leaves no space for anything else, which means the vehicles are going to be maybe sitting outside. And so that would be kind of disappointing. So by making the garage just several feet deeper, they could accommodate bigger cars. So the original project that we saw in September had it was, the ground floor was almost at grade. I'm assuming it was a concrete slab. And then the first floor was at 9 feet 8 inches, the floor to ceiling. And then the eave line was at 18 feet 2 inches. Now, the project that's come forward now, it's 21 feet 6 to the eave line. So the walls, regardless of the size of the building, the walls are taller. And so the appearance of the building is more boxy because of that. Since I'm not as graphically challenged, I'm sort of text challenged when I try to write things in descriptions. So I looked at the southern exposure, which the neighbor has to look at, and there's a deck on the second floor that overlooks. A couple of things. I would recommend that the guardrail on that part of the deck be more solid. When we're sitting, we see about 42 inches. That's our eye height. And that's about where guardrails are. So if it was solid from 32, 33 inches down, and then a little rail up above, we could work with the building codes, and then the people sitting on the deck wouldn't be looking at the houses. They'd still have a good view. And just as importantly, the neighbor's not looking up at the people on the deck. So there's a little more privacy. It's also a little bit of a wind barrier. They may want to consider any guardrails that are facing west. Just make them out of glass. You know, it's pretty common. It's more inert. We don't have to deal with, I like the way this particular style looks or doesn't look. So it takes all that out of the equation. I also did a simple sketch, and I just took, if we just lowered the floor to ceiling 1 foot on the combination of both floors and made things more horizontal rather than vertical. So on the south elevation, it would look more this way. And I just have it on tracing paper. I just took and sketched over. So it gives a horizontal element to the building and just made the wine cellar a little smaller. It doesn't need to be as tall. The scale of the main entrance is, I think, part of the challenge of when we look at that from the east, looking west. It's enormous. I mean, the door's 6 by 9, 6 door. I mean, it's just even the practicality of that opening. So there may be ways to change the look of that entrance and scale it down. So it still is a good entrance. And at the same time, there may be some ways of working with the roofing materials and the size. So it's a little more rain protected. So when you're standing going into the house, it's a little more rain protected. Could work a little better. So with the, so personally, and I don't want to impose this on my fellow commissioners, this sort of what I call Los Angeles Mediterranean style is kind of creeping its way into the coast. Don't mean to be flippant about that, but it's kind of, and evidently it's real marketable, and I don't want to argue with that.
It just left that whole community.
So that doesn't mean that there can't be that style that's really attractive and very nicely detailed. It's not what the guest house is, and my interpretation is that being compatible doesn't mean something has to look exactly the same. There could be differences. In the original, what we saw in September, the detailing had gable roofs and a few more arched kind of components. Now there's sort of a kind of almost mansard roof and this sort of low arched. And I think that combination gets cluttery and could be cleaned up. And then also this sort of giant stone pillars that identify one garage door is, I don't know if that's the main, anyway, that I would ask that be a requirement to go away. Now, the use of the stone is very nice, especially it helps to make horizontal elements. So the toughest one to get to is the sustainability. The west-facing glass is an enormous heat gain problem. the ways that we've dealt with that in the past are special coatings, screenings like are done at the museum down in Los Angeles, so you can see through these things, but they keep the heat out. It's a real challenge to have, I've faced it before, where you have the view, which is really valuable to the people that are living there, is the same direction that's tremendous glare and heat gain in the spring and in the fall. And so I don't see that this building yet is dealing with that. So they've got the view, and it's a challenge that the view, the southern exposure where they can get good heat gain is also looking at the neighbor. So there's a privacy question. So there's some conflicts that it can challenge the designer, but I think they can do more than they've done now. I think we can set our bar a lot higher than that. Same with the north-facing exposure. They've got a giant window with this big thing and like a cupola. I mean, it's like a dormer, and it's a bathtub that faces the creek. And so that's a little bit, because the creek is going to be people walking and probably right now people sleeping, and so there could be more that's done with, as well as just the size of the windows themselves. And the bigger challenge there's a surprising amount of heat gain here on the coast, even when it's foggy. And I don't see yet here a mechanism to have natural ventilation in this house. So I'd see that their PG&E bill is going to be just exciting. And as a community, maybe we have a way, so we don't have, our only guidelines that we can enforce are complying with Title 24 regulations. And that doesn't give us as a city any kind of teeth to say, I mean, all it does is allow people to put in materials that are maybe more efficient. Carpet that's made sustainably, or a more efficient water heater, or a more efficient heating system. Until we adopt something like the LEED system, where it's a point system for commercial buildings, in the residential sector, where we have a points where we can say, okay, we want this building to meet this many points. All I can do is kind of complain, and don't have a way to really make concrete suggestions and say, other than as a challenge to the designer that may be working with more horizontality and a variation in how the heights work, and starting to look at natural ventilation and the glazing areas, that the building could be something, whatever the size is, seem appropriate in scale when we're looking at it. And I completely agree with our Coastal Commission that says vegetation is not a good screen. I think my analogy is, if somebody writes a really lousy tune and a really lousy musician plays this really lousy tune, but nobody's listening to it, then it's okay. And this building is a permanent building on this property, and it should be a really elegant building, regardless of all of the rest of it. And I think that this could happen, and I look forward to really seeing that. And I appreciate very much. I know that professionally you'll be able to communicate what I'm saying to the owners, and I really appreciate that.
I have a house with a southwestern exposure with a passive solar design. It gets warm even on really cool days here on the coast. And so I think that, to John's point, to have a livable space with that much window, you really need to think about the ventilation in the upper stories, how those windows work, and glazing or some kind of coating, because it will become unbearable.
So in terms of colors, I agree with the other commissioners that I don't want to go down the road where we're saying you should paint it this color. But on a color scale where 10 is white and 1 is black, if it's between 3 and 5 is a darkness, it would really help reduce the size. Also in our findings, we're making a reference to the 2013 building code. It's now 2016. So we kind of get that. And I think I'm worn out.
All right. So
Motion,
chomping at the bit.
I was ready to make a motion to continue and wondered whether the staff wanted
I
a
had
date certain.
one other piece of feedback, and then we can move. Two other pieces of feedback. One, which is on the hemlock. If we could have a discussion with the Coastal Commission and just about a little latitude, if we are trying to do things like put in a trail, and if the owner is willing to work with us on those types of things, if we could consider a little latitude on what the setback is for the hemlock, given that hemlock's not necessarily an indicator of a riparian zone. And then the second thing is, as we look at a connected city and connected trails, thinking about how this is going to work when we're all done here. Jenna Lane is a very quirky street, and Oak Avenue is in particular a very quirky street that dead ends. One of the things to consider as part of this plan is, does the easement go along the driveway? That is, do you connect Jenna Lane with a trail or sidewalk or footpath from Jenna Lane and Cypress Avenue all the way over to Oak Avenue? Because right now you've got this really weird disconnected space, and so it'll make the trail much more usable, potentially allowing us to move the bike path to Jenna Lane as opposed to where it's at right now. Just these are things to think about, because it's not really connected to the trail. So with that, you were going to make a motion?
I'm going to ask through the chair whether staff wanted a date certain or whether they wanted it continued without a date. I move that we continue PDP 15-051, 32 Jenna Lane, to a later date to allow staff to consider the concerns that have been raised by the commission during tonight's hearing.
Second.
Can I get a vote? Aye.
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 So moved. Okay. It's now 9:30. We have another item on the agenda. I'd like to consider, what are we going to do here? Do you want to continue the meeting? Are we going to plan to extend the meeting tonight?
Through the chair, my suggestion, I believe that members of the public have come to speak on that, and while I'm not under the illusion that we'll get through everything we want to say in a half hour, we could at least, I think we owe the courtesy of the public that sat through this a chance to speak.
I think that's fine. I have no public comment cards on the next agenda item. So, Jill, how much time do you think we need to cover?
As much time as you want. We're queuing up the next session. We could take public comment if someone had come to this meeting with all their comments transcribed for staff. We would have taken them. So just whatever you need. We knew that this was going to take a while, and we're flexible.
So do you have a presentation?
I do not.
Okay. So let's just go and keep going through this, or do you want to?
I'm wondering if no one from the public is prepared to comment on this. I mean, I'd like to hear what they have to say, but if there are not only no speaker cards, but nobody actually wants to comment, maybe we can, or if somebody does want to comment.
No, people are shaking their heads.
Shaking their
I
heads.
see a significant other firmly shaking her head.
I'm perfectly willing to transcribe my comments and provide them to staff. They're in my usual minutia form, so I don't want to burden you with them.
I'm happy to submit my comments in writing as well.
Perfect. So can I have 3 minutes to
Yes,
just
please.
highlight a couple dates, because I think it will help us queue up your next session on coastal access and recreation will be July 25th, and you'll be in the Ted Adcock Center that night because we're getting a new floor in this space, so it will be not available. And you'll be in joint session with the Parks and Rec Commission, similar to the format that you had with the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee.
I know I read that in our plan, but what date was that again?
2 weeks from today, July 25th at Adcock. And we'll make sure we send something out before the end of the week. And our consultant will be there. We're looking forward to hearing their summation at this point for development of the parks master plan. They've reviewed existing conditions, and they have some findings for us that will be helpful for you at the policy level. The other thing we're hoping for is, speaking of written comments, we would like to, if you're going to submit some to us, we'd like to be able to put them in your packet for the August 8th meeting, which will be just Planning Commission and just Coastal Access and Recreation, community input, and we're hoping to get through your comments on that. If they're highly detailed, then submit them in writing. But if you have discussion items, give us a heads up so we can prepare materials if you need them.
If I recall correctly, in the staff document, you asked for us to have comments to you by the 27th.
We did, if you can. We have some staffing things going on, like vacation. Yeah.
I think we should all just
So we're trying to get you an early packet. And
yeah, no, I'd rather get an early packet, so my
Yeah.
fellow commissioners,
All right.
I'll try to get my comments in by the 28th.
All right, perfect. Let's see. The other thing we would like to note, this is something that we will keep doing, is we documented how we actually addressed your comments and the comments of the GPAC in your attachment from the Coastal Access and Recreation input that we had over the last year or so. And then we also started, so we're going to have a new log for your new comments, the comments coming in on this working draft. And we're not going to save them up. They're going to be prepared meeting by meeting so you can see them as we go. And we do need you to review them. This is more detailed than your minutes. This happened to be attachment 2 to this item, and it includes BPAC and PC comments. And just also wanted to note for the group that we really appreciated that last session and receiving the consensus statements from the Planning Commission regarding pursuit of Town Boulevard and the East Side Parallel Trail in particular.
Yes. Just a side note, on I think page 4 of those comments on the first of the 2 documents you gave us, there's some comments attributed to John Callan. I'm not sure those are actually his.
Oh, really? Okay.
They're with respect to access to Redondo Beach. Maybe they are.
I think they are.
Okay, very good.
Yep, they are. These were transcribed by someone else, so I tried to check every single one, but
Okay.
not easy to do. Okay,
Very good.
right. That's it.
Thank you. And thank you all for all the preparation and stress and anxiety that went into this meeting. Appreciate that. So with that, I think we have Planning Commissioner Communications, or the Planning Manager's report. Do you have a report today?
We have one glitch in our transfer of the Plan HMB website from our former planning consultant. The website has been down for a little bit, and we are trying daily to get it back up. And it's coming soon. But we know we've got some folks who are looking for documents, and we're trying to keep them available through your Planning Commission calendar, and we'll get it up as soon as we can, and we will announce that in any news that we send out to our mailing list. So if you hear about it, have them call us so we can get them what they want.
Very
Okay,
good.
yes.
Thank you. Okay. So we've covered the Planning Manager's report. You guys have any public communications? Okay. With that, can I get a motion?
So moved.
Seconded.
All right. Let's go.
Aye.
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 That was adjourned, to be clear.